Hey guys, welcome back. I finally got my hinges in the mail and I decided to order the cheap hinges. Um, these were, I want to say, like $6 for two. They are solid brass. They're just, real thin, kind of a little flimsy, and just definitely not as robust or as well machined as obviously the $80 ones. But I'm not going to spend $80 on two hinges for this desk. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So I got these, and now I'm at the stage where I've got to figure out how I want to put these on here, where I want to put them. And right away, I noticed something that's going to make it a little tricky. Typically, what I do is I create a little template with plywood and a fence that has a cutout that's perfectly matched to the hinge. And I can do that for this application, especially for the lid here. If you guys remember the lid, it's going to drop down. So on this side, I have to put a finish coat of polyurethane on the back of that yet. But at any rate, these hinges are going to sit sort of like that. And typically the barrel should be about halfway on, halfway off. And so that's fine because that's a 90-degree angle from the surface to the side. The issue that I'm running into now is that this desk, where I need to put the hinges over here, has an angle. I'll try to get on the side so that you can see what I'm talking about. But if I want my barrel to end up right here, I've got a little angle I've got to deal with, which means, one of the nice things about using a jig, that plywood jig that I talked about just a second ago, is that it's universal. You can use it for all four locations. It's sized for one leaf, and so you can literally use it all four times. But in this case I can't, because if I used it right here, the hinge is going to end up coming off the desk sitting about there because of this angle. So I'm going to actually have to make two jigs, one for this half of the desk with a little longer of a cutout so that the hinge sits back from where the registration fence would be, which is right around here as opposed to here. So I don't know if I'll record myself making it. I might, but I'll definitely show you when it's finished, and I'll definitely record the process of routing out the mortises. So see you then. Alright guys, quick update. I've gone ahead and started making the first of my two hinge jigs. So what I did here, this is just 1/4-inch plywood scrap. I'm going to take the hinge. You're going to position it on the plywood. Now, as I said before in a previous video, I typically like the barrel of the hinge to be about half on, half off. That usually gives me good clearance between the two pieces that are being hinged together. So after that, I held it firmly. I used a square to make sure that it was square, and then I traced around it with a pencil. Sharp mechanical pencil, something that gets right up next to the edges, because this is, and you'll see why here shortly, it's pretty critical that this step is done properly. Once that's done, I use the very same square I used to square the hinge, and then took a marking knife and basically traced over the lines with a marking knife, being sure that I am directly on top of the pencil lines. I then transferred the pencil lines to the edge of the plywood, and now I'm going to use those marks and the square. I'm going to put my knife right in that marking knife line, and then slide my square over to it and transfer the lines back down on the other side. And how I did the lateral line here, if you might be wondering, I used a double square and set it to where the pencil line was, and now that I just kind of slid that over as I used my marking knife to make that line. But you want to keep that, because that setting now, when I go to transfer over here, is going to be the same. So once I get my verticals, I can just use that same setting and the vertical line will be the same on the front and the back. After that, it goes to the bandsaw, and I'm going to bandsaw out the waist, which is that portion in the middle, and then I'm going to glue a fence on the edge, and it'll pretty much be ready. So stay tuned. Okay, I made a little more progress since the last video. What I did, obviously I made this piece. I went ahead and made the fence. Now all the fence has to do is be the exact size of your opening. And so what I did, if this was the piece before I cut it, was laid it down square to the edge, used my marking knife to cut inside each, and then you basically just hollow out a little space, and what that's going to do is allow room for a top bearing mounted flush trim router bit to ride along the inside of this template, routing out the waist below it. That said, it has to have a little bit of clearance for that router bit, because this is going to be sitting on top of the surface. If it makes any sense. Doesn't need to be too much, just enough. And when you get into it, you'll be able to tell how much will be enough. So, at any rate, now I've got to attach the fence to the piece of plywood, which can be a little tricky because the only glue surface I have, because I chose to use 1/4 inch plywood, is the end grain of the 1/4 inch plywood and this little poplar piece. So what I theorize, and I think I've done this before, is I use a little bit of super glue, and that's just going to give me a quick bond and act as a clamp, and then I'm also going to use some wood glue so that once everything cures, it's got a little bit of strength to it. Alright, so here goes nothing. I'm using Tight Bond Quick and Thick again. So let's do a dot here, a dot here, dot here, a dot here. Now alignment is sort of important on this because this gap has to line up perfectly with that gap, so you got to kind of be careful. Probably too much glue, so we'll have a little bit of cleanup to do, but that's fine. Better too much than not enough. Okay, and now I'm going to use my activator. If you guys don't use this stuff, I would recommend it for the when you're using this super glue. It's awesome. It basically, super glue already cures pretty quickly, but once you spray this stuff, you get about 10 seconds, I'd say. Which is perfect for this application. Okay. I'll get my fingers out of here without getting them stuck. That looks pretty good. Yep, and that's it. She's on there. Now, if you're off by a hair, it's fine. You can come back and trim. This space here is just clearance. It's just clearance. It's really not that critical. It's the space in here that's critical, because this is the surface that the bearing is going to ride on. That's going to dictate then the outline of the mortise. So if you're off on this piece, your mortise is going to be off, and the hinge is not going to fit very well. And so obviously several times throughout this process, certainly before I even got to this step, I went ahead and fit the hinge in. And you want a tight fit. You want a nice tight fit. Now that's hitting, I think, right here. I got a little bit to clean up. Again, this is not critical. This is critical. But you want a tight fit. You don't want it to be loose, because then the mortise is going to be loose. If, like most things in woodworking, if it's a little too small, you can always make it bigger. If it's too big, you really can't make it smaller. So I'm going to let this dry, and I'm going to start working on the other jig once I figure out how to do that. And I'll turn the camera back on then. So I've figured out what I needed to do. I needed to bump the front of the mortise up 3/16 of an inch. Now this is where the mortise location would have been on the lid itself, but because of that angle on the desk, it actually needs to come in this far so as not to produce a gap where the hinge is. So I went ahead and I measured that out. Again, I followed my same process, squared it up, pencil line, knife line over the pencil line, and I just wanted to show you how I transfer the lines. Obviously this was easy. Got the square up, put my knife in the knife line, slid the square over, hold it in place, and simply mark. Now when we're flipping it over, we're doing the same thing. You're putting the knife in the knife line, sliding the square over, and making your cut. So go ahead and finish this one. And now, with my double square set to the depth that I want, and real quick, I was tempted on this side to use my square like this to knife that line in. And I don't know if you can see this, but it is off ever so slightly, and that's because I'm introducing another, I'm introducing more room for error. I don't know that this is 90 degrees, and if this is not 90 degrees, then this line that I create using this square off of this reference edge is not going to be 90 degrees to this knife line. So resist the temptation to do that. I know it's easier, but stick with the double square and just use the depth, because the depth is going from the front as a registration surface, which you've been using to create your 90 degree pencil lines and knife lines. And I'm on the wrong face. Anytime I'm woodworking, especially in situations like this where it's very easy to make a small miscalculation, I try to avoid creating any more room for error than I absolutely have to. That's also why I always fill my knife lines in with pencil. And mark the waist. Alright, I'm going to head to the bandsaw, get this cut out. Alright, both of the jigs are complete. I just wanted to show you guys how I plan on using them, and then I, of course, will record myself using them. So here is the desk side, and again, that's the side that's going to be 3/16 inch deeper than the lid. So what I'm going to do, hopefully I got to figure out how to clamp this down because of the shape and the nature of the desk, but I'll figure something out. I'm going to find a distance from each side, inside, probably something about right there. Because the thing is, when this thing is laying flat, you're going to have the barrels sticking up and interfering with the desk surface. So in an ideal world, you would want those kind of as far outside of the main area as possible so that it didn't interfere. And I plan on using this desk for like my laptop and whatever else, mail, reading magazines, I'm not sure, we'll see. But the point is, you wouldn't want to put the thing, wouldn't want something right there in the middle where you're sliding something around, it's going to hit the barrel. So I'll probably end up putting it out here, right there. Now I do have to trim the edge of this. Typically I like to keep the fence the same width as the plate, because obviously as it is now I can go here on this side, but if I try to go, well, actually it sticks over, so yeah, I might be alright. It doesn't always work out like that. Sometimes if you're doing a cabinet, this can actually impede your ability to place the hinge where you want it. So there's no hard and fast rule about the fence. Like I said, the fence is more of a registration surface to register the important part, which is this piece on the top. So this is the one that's going to be for the desk, and then this is the one that's going to be for the lid. And you notice I do write on these. So what's cool about making these jigs is you only ever have to make one. Obviously, this is the one that's pretty standard if you're making a box or a cabinet or most anything other than this slant front desk with a slant with an angle on it. You're going to use this one. So I will put this in my permanent collection, which features probably 8 to 10 of these by now, of pretty standard hinge sizes. So you make it one time, you make that investment in your time, and now you have this jig to use, theoretically for the rest of your woodworking career. This special one I probably will trash because, again, it just takes into account this special angle that I got to deal with here that probably will never present itself again. So that's it for the jig making. The next video I will have will be me routing the mortises, and for that I will be using, hopefully I have this thing out here. Well, I don't see it. Well, how about this? When I find it and get it hooked up to my router, I will show you. It's basically a flush trim bit with a top mounted bearing. So I'm going to take my trim router and set the depth that I want, probably referencing off of the hinge leaf thickness, and I'm going to go multiple passes. I'm going to go light first. I'm going to set it, and the bearing is actually going to ride around the interior of this little cutout, and what's going to be left is a perfect mortise that's exactly this space. Now it's going to have rounded corners, no big deal. You're going to go in with the chisel, you're going to square those off. The cool thing is, so once I do the desk side, and I think the desk side I'm just going to mortise them out until the leaf is just flush with the desk surface. Now the lid, you can usually play with one side or the other. The lid I will be able to, I'm going to do it flush first, and then I'm going to come around here and take a look at what kind of gap I have. If there's too much of a gap here between the lid and the desk, I can always mortise just a little bit deeper into the desk lid, and what that will do is will kind of close that gap. And that's what I'm aiming for, is not a huge gap. Usually typically have a little bit of a gap where the hinge is, but I don't want something that's like 1/8 of an inch. So probably a 1/16 or less. I will tune back in when I have the router out. See you then. Alright, so I am set up. Couple things that occurred to me while I was setting up. I was about to jump right in and start routing the desk, the lid, but then I remembered that the lid overlays the desk compartment. So I think in that case it would be wise for me to route the desk first, because this is where I want to be sure of the placement of the hinges. The lid doesn't matter so much, but that said, then I'm going to, once I have these mortises done, I'm going to have to lay the desk surface up, and then use the mortise edge as a guide to make a knife mark in the lid, and then use those knife marks then in the lid to set up my jig for the mortises for the lid. So I am set up right now. I got a deep reach clamp on. I made sure that the clamp as it's positioned is not going to interfere with the base plate of my router or any part. I'm using a battery powered router, so that was a little tricky, but I got it. It's secure. It's not going to move, and I took precaution that the fence is all the way referenced against the edge of the desk. If this is off, this is critical. If this is off, if this is not completely up against the desk surface, then your hinge mortise is going to be canted to one side or the other, which Then when you go to make a mortise in the desk lid, if that's straight and this is crooked, they're not going to match up too well, and you're really going to be in trouble. So this is a little nerve-wracking. So here we go. I'm going to do one. I'm trying to figure out a place to put the camera. You guys will be able to see it. I think perhaps I could set you right here. Yeah, that's not the greatest view, but you'll be able to see the finished product. So, oh, another thing to take note of. So, unlike a typical routing application, because we're using this jig, the jig is 1/4 inch plywood, and not exactly 1/4 inch. You guys know that plywood is never dead on. So it's probably, I don't know, 5 millimeters or something like that. It's less than 1/4 inch. You have to factor that in then with the depth setting of your router. And I had told you earlier about the bit that I'm using. That's the bit. It's just a flush trim, and I had said top mounted bearing. I don't know if that's considered top or bottom. It's the top of the cutter as I have it, so that's why I said top mounted. But anyway, that's the bit I'm using. Whiteside makes it. It's like less than 20 bucks. So I had to factor in the depth of the jig, because the router bit not only has to plunge the mortise, it's also got to take into account the depth. So I went ahead and dropped my router bit until it made contact with the desk surface. That way I knew the thickness of the plywood as it relates to the bit, and then I used this scale on my router to drop it down what I thought was just shy of the thickness of the leaf. So we'll see how accurate I was here in a minute. Okay, so one thing I just noticed, and this is what's nice about these real-time videos, is the depth of the jig is not deep enough to take into account the bearing of my router bit. In other words, when I'm pushing this down, if I were to go ahead and route right now, the bearing would be riding above the jig. That's not good. So I'm glad I caught that. Not a big deal. All I'm going to do is take the jig off and double-sided tape some spacers underneath to kind of raise that up a little more so that it hits the bearing. So I will be right back. Alright, we're back. So what I did, I found some 1/4 inch MDF and glued some 1/4 inch MDF spacers underneath just to bump this up far enough so that it will make contact with the bearing. Again, that's kind of the whole idea behind this. If the bearing is not in contact with the edge of this plywood, I'm just going to be free routing, and it's going to be a mess. I'm not sure why that happened. Most of my jigs I use 1/4 inch plywood. This is a new router. Maybe it has something to do with that. I know some of you will probably see pretty quickly what the problem is with a fresh set of eyes and a little more focus than I've got right now. But it works. It's set up. I'm going to go ahead and route it. Wish me luck. was it. It's a little bumpier than I had hoped. I think I caught a snag on the way in. It's important to clean up the glue squeeze out on the top. And I was kind of rushing this because it's Friday night. I just got home from work and we just ordered some Chinese food and I'm trying to go up there and enjoy that. So, rule number one, don't rush. Not a big deal. It's just a little bit of a, I would say like a 64th of an inch kind of dip there in the front. I'm going to get a chisel and clean it out and see what we're left with. Hang tight while I grab the hinge. Now ideally, I can kind of slide this in here and test it without moving it. And that's actually really nice. So what I've done is I've set the hinge down in the pocket and I can feel that the hinge leaf sits just ever so slightly below the surface of the desk. So that's actually a nice mortise. That being so, I'm going to go ahead and remove the clamp. And there is the mortise. Doesn't look like much, but it's going to be a perfect fit. As soon as I square those corners, I'll be able to slide that right back, and that is perfect. I love that. All right, so I will go ahead and square the corners, do the other one, and turn the camera back on and show you what it looks like when they're all done. All right, guys, I'm back. So I went ahead and routed the other mortise. This one worked out a lot better. As I said, this one was a little rough because there was some glue squeeze out on the top of the jig. The seam where the fence meets the plate had some glue squeeze out, so that was causing the router to kind of jump around a little bit. So I chiseled that off, flushed it all up, and the end result is a much cleaner mortise. I still have a little bit of a divot there, but again, not a big deal, as long as I would say, looking at that, probably 85% of that mortise is nice and flat, and that should be plenty to stabilize that leaf. The depth is alright, I like it. The only issue is that when I put this hinge in here, and as you can see, I've got a nice, in fact, I'm going to set you guys up on the tripod here so I can use both hands so that I do not destroy my hard work. So when I put this in, and this is usually how I do it, I insert it in the mortise and slide it forward. That's a beautiful fit. However, it's proud by just maybe a thou or 2 thou, and I'm not sure that I like that. So that I might go back and fix. If I do fix that, it's going to be with a handheld router plane, and if I use that, I'll show it to you. I might even show it to you if I don't use it, just so you know what I'm talking about. But the problem with this arrangement, routing mortises like this, the odds of me getting the jig back in place over top of the mortise and then trying to reroute and go a little deeper, the odds are pretty slim that I would get it right on, and it has to be right on. If it's even just a hair off, there's going to be a shadow line to the left or right of the hinge, and I don't want that. So I'm going to leave it be, leave the edges defined as they were by the router, which is perfect, and any fine tuning from here on out is going to be done by hand, as I said, a router plane and or a chisel or both. Now, the other issue is I was aiming, I'm not sure how this happened, but I was aiming again to have the barrel about halfway across the edge of the desk. So the barrel should be halfway across this leading edge of the desk surface, but it's not. It's actually sitting pretty well past it, or kind of the beginning of the barrel is right on that leading edge of the desk, and so it's sitting forward about a 1/16 or maybe a 1.5/16 of an inch further. And what that's going to do is, imagine I've got the lid on now, and this is your view from the side. in order for there to be no gap, I would have to route that deep of a mortise in the lid. And of course that would look pretty silly to have a big deep mortise in the lid and a proud mortise up here. So what I'll probably do is, once I've got this excavated down to the right depth, I will use a marking gauge, the same one I used if you watched my salt box video, to basically scribe a cut line as far deep as I need to go. I would say probably, like I said, about a 1/16 or 1/16 and a half further. And I'm just going to use that marking gauge to run parallel to the edge of the desk and just cut a line here, and then use a chisel to follow these lines up, connect it, and then use a chisel flat in the mortise to kind of pop that waste out. And in theory, that's going to allow me to slide that hinge forward enough. And ultimately, what your goal should be, or at least what my goal here is, the depth of the hinge leaf in this mortise should be the same as the depth of the hinge leaf in this mortise. Again, if I were to route the same depth in this, I'd have probably an 1/8 of an inch gap over here on the side where the hinge is, and then obviously it would gradually taper down to nothing at the top right there. So I don't want that. I'm not going to do that. So I got a little work to do. This is usually how this kind of stuff happens. I just kind of roll with it and fix the mistakes or the problems as they arise. So that's going to be one that I'm going to have to fix. The next thing is marking the mortise position on the lid. And so what I've done is I've put the lid up here. I've got it oriented the right way. I had a little repair that I had to do on this edge of the lid, and so that's going to be the downside, because you'll never see that repair now. And then I've got it centered on the desk opening, so I'm looking at probably an 1/8 of an inch, a fat 1/8 of an inch overhang over here, and I'm looking at about a fat 1/8 of an inch overhang over here. So that is centered. The next step is to basically make a cut line that continues that mortise over here onto the lid. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. Typically I would just take a knife and run across, but because I have an angle here, there's a gap. And so I came up with an idea. If I take this rule and I slide it right to the edge of the mortise, in theory now, I should be able to take a marking knife and scratch a little line and that should give me the edge of where I need to put my jig to route a mortise right here. And I'm going to do the opposite thing over here. And because I'm right-handed, I'm going to do the right side. Now I'm not pressing real deep, because again, I'm just trying to make a mark so that I can slide my jig over to the mark. And the issue is, I'm marking on the right side of my rule. If I press too deep, it's going to make a big fat indentation in the wood, and that's actually going to stick out past where I want to route. So I'm just basically scratching the surface of the wood here so that I know where to put my jig. And that looks good. That's perfect. And the one over here is perfect. Now what I mean by scratching, see if I can zoom in on this here. It is not a cut at all. It is literally just a scratch. And it's pretty much perfectly in line with that edge. So that's it. Now I'm going to reposition the lid to a better spot and go ahead and route those mortises. And now we route the lid mortises. Good, and that was right on my scratch mark. All right, and now for the next one. This can be a little finicky here, this part, trying to get the clamp to squeeze without shifting the position of the jig. But I think I've got it. Perfect. Go ahead and lock it in. And route the next one. I will tune back in when I get the corners squared off, and we'll go from there. So this is a router plane. This is actually the box that I made for the router plane. Some of you might have seen this already. This is actually a Veritas model. And so how this works is it's got a dead flat cast iron base plate that is designed to sit above a mortise, and then the cutter can be lowered and raised with this little wheel here locked into position with various other wheels, and it will allow you to basically excavate a mortise to an exact depth across the bottom of it. So I went ahead and routed these mortises in the lids. They came out looking really nice. I squared the corners. They're nice and flat, ready to go. Now I want to go ahead and knock the level of these down with the router plane. At that point, because it's such a tight fit with the hinges and the mortises, I might try to slap them in there and see if it will hold well enough for me to take a look and see what kind of gap I'm working with. If it's not too bad, if it works and it's not too bad, I might just call it okay and send the screws in. If it's still too bad of a gap, then like I said, I'm going to get the marking knife out and push this mortise forward a little bit. So here goes nothing. Honestly, I've got this spear tip blade in here, and I normally use that because it breaks the wood fibers better, but in this case I don't want to take a whole lot off, and because of that I'm going to go ahead and throw the flat edged blade in there, so bear with me. Alright, now that locks it into place. And now the next step is to obviously loosen your depth stop, but well, you gotta loosen that too. It's been a while since I used this. Now we're gonna go ahead and lower the cutter until it just makes contact with the bottom of the mortise. And that is right there. You don't want to take a lot off. That's the whole idea behind this machine, or hand tool as it were. In fact, I think I might have... See, the thing about router planes is that you can drop the cutter down, but as soon as you lock it into place, it actually pulls it back and drops it down even more. So it takes a little bit of practice to sneak up on the perfect depth setting. Not to mention the fact that it's hard to tell when it engages. And as with any cutting instrument, using a shearing cut is always a good practice, especially in a hardwood like this maple. The other trick is you can push it, you can pull it, you can slide it, you can spin it, you can do whatever you got to do to make the cut as clean as possible. And then in this instance, you've got these little fibers. Hopefully you can see that. These little fibers sticking up. Just come in with the chisel. Same kind of deal, squaring the corners off. Press it right to the side of the mortise and rock it back. Sever them off. You can just come in like this and blow them out. Now I can see, as long as your chisel is dead flat, you can kind of go in after the fact right up to the edges and the corners, places where the tool, the router plane didn't reach, and just kind of do a finishing touch. All right, so that wasn't very much. If I had to guess, that was probably 3 or 4 thousandths. Go ahead and slide this in and see what happens. Yeah, it barely made a difference, so we got to keep going. No biggie. Now, however, we have our cutter set, so ideally we would just turn it ever so slightly, lock it back into position, and now we should be able to go ahead and take off another few thou. You want to be careful that those pieces don't fold over the edge of the mortise and end up getting stuck under your base plate, because that's going to affect the depth of cut, obviously. Oh man, yeah, to think that back in the day this is all they had. They didn't have a router. Sure as heck didn't have a battery powered router. So I enjoy using hand tools. I mean, I certainly wouldn't build something like this whole desk with just hand tools. Maybe I will sometime down the road, but for now most of my projects are furniture items that I need you know, I need somewhere, this desk I need somewhere to put my laptop to work on it, and I don't want to wait the probably 5 years it would take me to build it with just hand tools. I could see myself doing something like that once I retire. Okay, now that is almost there. That is probably 1/1000th of an inch, maybe half a thou above the surface, or proud, as us woodworkers call it. So I'm going to go back in for one more. Actually, giving bad instruction. So the mistake I was just about to make was to go to my third depth setting over here on this guy. And I guess I could do that. Alright, so let me tell you what I'm talking about here. I have 2 mortises to do. So typically when you're working with 2 mortises, or more than one mortise, I should have gone after I did my initial depth setting and removed stock to the other one and removed stock, then dropped it down, did the same thing, removed stock here, removed stock here. The problem is if you go all the way through one mortise, you drop down 3 depth settings. Now that's too aggressive of a cut if I take it back over here and try to use it over here. So I'd have to kind of go back to my original depth setting, but there's no way to adjust that. And then I remembered there actually is a depth stop. I just have never used it. So even still, I'm going to do it the way I just told you. I could set this, I could go ahead, drop it down again, get it to where I like it, set the depth stop at that depth, and then trust that that's going to be right, and then go ahead and go through the process all over again. But I feel like it would be easier if I just use the setting I have already and see if I can get in here. Hopefully it's not too aggressive on this one. And you know what? It is. So that is why you do what I just said. After the first cut, go ahead and do your other mortises. That way you only have to set your depths one time. Alright, so let me loosen this down a little, lock it in place. The other nice thing about this router plane, or any router plane, or most router plane, I can't say any router plane, but this one in particular, Lee Nielsen makes a nice one. Some of the old classic Stanleys are good. Is they're actually more accurate than a router in some cases. My router jig was relying on the flatness of the jig that I made, whereas this is simply relying on the flatness of the surrounding the desk, which is really the reference that you want because the hinge is going into the desk. Yeah, like if you, I'm gonna put the camera on that in a second, but the mortise looks a lot cleaner and a lot smoother now after having used this tool. Plus, now I can say I installed the mortises, or the hinges, using hand tools. Cheated a little bit, but I'm not going to say anything. Are you? Lighting. This is a excellent reason why you should have your chisels dead flat, and if you can see that, you can see how shiny that is. That is, if you get a reflection, let me see if I can do it here. You can see that light. There's virtually no distortion. That indicates perfectly flat back. And that allows me to use the rest of the mortise as a reference, and so any bumps or high spots should get shaved off just by sliding your chisel across the mortise bottom. Oh man, that is flawless. That is absolutely perfect. Awesome. Okay, so I am going to bring my depth stop up and lock it in place so that now I know if I drop my cutter down to there, ultimately I will end up with the same depth on this one as I do on this one. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it around and do the other mortise, but I'm sure you guys don't want to watch that process all over again. So I'm going to turn the camera off now and tune back in when I've got them all ready. See you. Okay, so the hinge mortises are routed. They are router planed to an exact depth. The corners are squared. They're cleaned up. I went ahead and fitted the hinges, and so in some instances, it might be off by a hair. And what I tend to do in that case, and what I did in this case, I can't really slide that in with one hand, but you get the idea, is actually file down the hinge, file down the sides of the hinges, and or hit it with some real fine sandpaper to get it a perfect fit. Because if you start trying to take a chisel to the edges, to the perimeter of this mortise, the chances that you're going to mess up the geometry and end up with a gap are tremendous. The chances that you can unevenly sand the metal are much less. Metal is hard, it does not a lot comes off, and so you can really play with these hinges and get a perfect fit by taking metal off the hinge. I usually use 80 grit sandpaper, lay it down on a hard surface, and just take the hinge and rub it back and forth on the sandpaper. And then I always take 1000 grit at the end and polish it back out, make sure there's no sharp edges. So all that was done. I then put the appropriate, and I always like to label mine because not all hinges are identical. They can be a few thousandths of an inch bigger, deeper, wider, etc. So I label them. This is left desk, so I know that goes there, which means this obviously would have to go here. I put the hinges in, and now some guys have those self-centering bits. I have one. They don't really work that well for me, at least mine doesn't. So what I do is I draw a little circle with a red pencil, or any kind of pencil, and I'm going to come back, not with that drill bit, that just happened to be in the drill, with a much smaller drill bit that is sized roughly to the shaft of the screw. Now these are brass hinges, they come with brass screws. They're not the fancy ones, so I don't have a steel screw. I could probably find one, but I'm just going to drill a hole. I'm going to find a drill bit that matches the shank of that screw without the threads. So if you can imagine, that would just be a brass pin. Take the threads off. I'm going to find a drill bit that's about that diameter and drill holes using that to the right depth, and then just run the screws in by hand. So here goes that. Bear with me while I find my proper drill bit. Good drill bits. I have good drill bits and I have bad drill bits. My good drill bits I use for precision work, only on wood, etc. And I have a set of junk drill bits that I'll just use on whatever, oftentimes metal. And so all I'm doing here is holding the drill bit behind the screw shank to try to find a size. Basically, I can't see the drill bit behind the screw. It's still a little big, so it looks like 3/32 is going to be just about right. And honestly, I might go a little bit smaller than that. I might go to 5/64 because this is a heavy lid, and I want a lot of holding power. So that's it. In this instance, 5/64 is the magic number. So we're going to come out here, and I'm going to chuck this up in my drill and try to locate, some guys like to locate the hole a little bit toward the back of the hinge, and in theory they say that pulls the hinge tighter into the pocket. But I've tried that before and it hasn't worked out real well, so I just center it. Now luckily on this desk, I do not have to worry about going through and puncturing anything, because that's a double thick 3/4 maple. And it's critical, but it's not that critical, but it's fairly critical that you get these centered. Because if you get a screw hole that's off center, it's going to end up wanting to pull the hinge in a direction that it's not supposed to go, and or the screw head will not sit down flush in the pocket, and both of those can present problems. Now on this one I've got to be a little careful. In fact, I don't think I tested these, but yes, these are going to be fine. Just barely. I'll have a 1/16 of an inch of clearance on the back side. Now this is veneered MDF, so I'm not really worried about going to depth on this stuff because it's very soft, but the maple you definitely want to go to depth, because a brass screw of that size is certainly not going to plow through the fibers of hard maple without you stripping the head out. So. Now normally, and I didn't do it this time, which is odd, probably because I have the camera rolling, I tend to try to think about explaining what I'm doing, and so I lose track of what my typical procedure is. Typically I would take an awl and make a mark dead center, and what that does is allows you to, as long as your awl mark is dead center, it's a lot easier to get an awl into dead center than it is to hold this drill and end up having to go perfectly. So use an awl. I didn't, but use an awl. Get a little mark, a divot right in the center, and then the drill bit will just follow that right down. Okay. Now, a little secret. I don't know how I did this. I mean, I have a feeling I know. It was because of me having to play with the hinges. Originally, when and you guys probably remember this thing sat about that far back because there's an angle on the desk, but the desk lid was flat. And so when I went to install the hinges, well, look what I found. Uh-oh. So I had to do some quick thinking and figure out how I could. I didn't want to put a filler piece of Sapelli in there. So what I did was found out the angle of the desk, which was 20, who knows? I forget what it was, but anyway, I basically matched that angle and used my track saw to cut that angle in the bottom of the lid. And it looks pretty good. It looks, once I put some finish on it, it will look like it was meant to be that way. So that's all I did there, and now I will, now the hinges will match up perfectly as you saw. Bear with me as I spin this back around. But now the hinge mortises butt up perfectly to each other, and that is what you want. You do not want a gap there, unless you've taken into account the gap, which is, I guess, what I did not do. I installed these hinges as though they would be hinges on all the other stuff that I've installed hinges on, which are usually boxes and or cabinets, and that's a little different. You usually don't have an angle to deal with. So that's that. I'm going to go ahead and install the screws and turn you back on and let you see how it turned out. Okay, moment of truth, guys. Boom. I did it. How about that? That's pretty sharp looking, huh? And now, pull out the lid stays, drop it down. Nice. Now I just gotta put my final coat of some sort of urethane on here. It's going to be a writing surface. It's going to take a lot of abuse, so I am not sure what I'm going to do on it. Obviously, I've got to clean up the gallery area, but I'm happy. Now, the screws aren't all the way down. I've got to polish the hinges. I've got to do a little more finishing work on it. I've obviously got to put a cap on the top. I had told you in a previous video I had left this unfinished because typically with a Philadelphia secretary there is a cabinet, a two-door cabinet sitting on top. But I was not sure that I would have the room for it, so I wanted to make it modular. So what I'll probably do is just put a nice little maple board on top, or I don't know how many boards, but I'll just glue up a panel that will sit on top and affix from underneath somehow. Might have to take the gallery out to put a couple screws up from underneath into it. I might design it so that it can just sit on there. Maybe because I left a little gap, I can put a little runner on the bottom side, and it'll kind of sit down in there and lock it in place so it doesn't shift around, but it can just be lifted off. And then down the road, if I decide to move the desk into a bigger area, I can go ahead and build that cabinet. So there it is. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And I'm glad that you guys got to see me make some mistakes, because I make mistakes on every project. And you've heard me say this before if you've seen my other videos. I spend probably 60% of the project fixing or working around issues and mistakes, and that's just kind of part of the fun of it, at least for me. So that's all for now. I'll see you next time. Thanks.